Today we're going to be looking at one of the most important stories in the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph rising to be the second most powerful person in Egypt. And in that story, he ended up saving nearly the entire known world. Joseph's story lasts from chapter 37 all the way up to chapter 46. That's 9 chapters devoted to telling his story, which means that it's really important. And so today I want to talk about the story of Joseph and how his life changed everything for the people of God. Now, in the story of Joseph, he was hated by his brothers because he was treated better by his father, and he had dreams that God had given him. These dreams his brothers always hated because they thought that God favored him over them. And so because of these dreams, they were plotting against him. Later on in the story, they decide to sell him into slavery in Egypt. Now, he rose through power in Egypt and eventually was the head of the household of one of the royal people of Egypt. But because of a bad story that was told about him, he was thrown in prison for years. In prison, he gained the favor of everyone that he interacted with because God was with him. Later on, he was able to leave prison, and because of the favor that he earned, he started to rise in power in Egypt, and eventually he sat at the right hand of Pharaoh. He was the second most powerful person in the entire country. While Joseph was working for Pharaoh, he had a dream that there would be a plague that would run through Egypt, and that there would be a huge shortage of food throughout the entire known world. Because of this, Egypt stockpiled food for 7 years. And after that 7 years, when this famine hit, Egypt was the only place that had food, and people from around the world came to them asking if they could have something to eat. And among those people that came to Egypt were Joseph's brothers that had sold him into slavery. And in the story, when they interact with him, they have no idea who he is. And because of the things that were done to him, Joseph should have hated them. But because of his love for God, he loved his brothers. And because of that story, Joseph was able to bring his brothers in and to say, "I forgive you for everything that you did to me." And in that story, we see that even though he was sold into slavery, that ended up being used for good. He was able to save everyone in the known world from this massive famine that was happening, and he was able to join his family back together. A lot of people today will look at the story of Joseph, and they'll wonder why it's important to them. I mean, this doesn't affect our lives today. It's a great story about how someone saved everyone's lives, but it's thousands of years ago. And why is that important to me? Well, I want to summarize the story and point you guys towards why that story is so important to us. Now, in the story of Joseph, he was just a regular guy, but at the same time, because of God's plan, was the most important and influential person alive. He was wrongfully accused of things that he didn't do, even though he was living his life in a way trying to follow the plan that God had for him. Because of those crimes that he was accused of, he had to pay the price, even though he had done nothing wrong. And because he was faithful to God throughout the entire story, God brought him out and used him as a tool to save the entire world. Now, why is that important to us? Well, there's a very similar story later on in the Bible of a guy you might have heard of named Jesus. And in the story of Jesus, he was a regular guy, but at the same time, because of God's plan, and because he was the Son of God, he was the most important and influential person in the world. He was wrongfully accused of things that he hadn't done, and of crimes that he hadn't committed, and he had to pay a price that he didn't deserve. But because he did so, he was able to save the entire world. Not just the people that were alive, but the people who are yet to come. So when we look at the story of Joseph and the way that he lived his life out, it's not just some unapplicable story from history. It's a story that points us towards the importance of Jesus and towards the importance of knowing the story of God. Because without God, we're all nothing. And without the price that he paid, we would be hopeless. And so when you guys read the story of Joseph, I want you to remember what it points us towards and the importance of that story. Because everything in the Bible points towards the story of Jesus. And if you don't take anything away from this, I want you guys to remember that God loves you so much that he sent his only son. And so when you're going about your week, remember the importance of the story of Joseph and how it points us back to God.